I guess I just want to start off by being clear about what I'm not saying, because often our concerns are misconstrued, and so I just want to be very clear. It's often said that what I've been saying in my critique is that the IMF is preventing countries from spending more on health care. And while that's sort of true, I don't mean to make it so direct. There are anecdotal cases where the IMF has, in one way or another, expressed concern about overspending on health personnel and that kind of thing. And that's true, but I'm not really saying that the IMF goes into a country and says, don't spend more on health. Okay, that's what I'm not saying. I am saying that there's a series of more indirect steps that all culminate in the same kind of outcome. So what I think a better, more careful way to make a synopsis of my critique would be to say that the development model that has been pursued by the IMF and the World Bank over the last few decades is one in which undermines the ability of countries themselves to generate more public revenues, more tax revenue. And that, in turn, has undermined the ability of countries to scale up public investment as a percent of GDP over many years. And that, in turn, has led to a lack of investment in essential infrastructure, with health infrastructure being only one type of infrastructure that has been underinvested in. And so the consequences of that series of steps over many years across many countries has led to the inability of countries to invest properly in health, be it their recurrent health budget or in the underlying health infrastructure. And then the consequences of that, I argue in my book, have been unfortunately quite deadly for people on the ground in countries. And so that's a more comprehensive, but I think more roundabout way of actually explaining what I've been saying. It's very easy for the IMF to come in and say we don't tell countries not to spend more on health, because that's essentially correct. The IMF doesn't do that. But what I have been concerned about much more is the broader economic development model. And so I guess what I would really like to draw your attention to is bigger, broader questions about the development model as we've come to know it, or I guess, in the last few decades. And I think a lot about development just as a concept. And one of the things that's frustrated me tremendously over time is the inability of people to tell me what development is. Even organizations with development in their names, like DFID or USAID or Center for Global Development. You ask people, what is development? How do you know a successfully developing country when you see it? And you'd be surprised the blank faces you get. And to me, that's a little disturbing, right? Other things that I feel like aren't very clear in people's minds are about the relationship, I think, between governments and their domestic companies. I think the rhetoric and the discourse of the last 30 years is wrong. And the rhetoric and the discourse of what I would call neoliberal ideas is that there's this antagonism, this false dichotomy, or this tension between governments and their domestic companies. And certainly in countries that have horrible problems with corruption and nepotism, in which you can't do business without having the right connections, that's a problem. But I think what the neoliberal approach has done is to create a false dichotomy, a false tension, where in fact, if you look at the history of how all the rich countries industrialized successfully in the last few hundred years, you'll see that in fact that relationship, and I do call it a relationship, that relationship between governments and their domestic companies is an intensive one, or it ought to be. It's an iterative relationship. Companies do things for governments, governments do things to beef up their domestic companies. It's an iterative relationship. You scratch my back, I scratch your back. But unfortunately, what I feel like is that in the last 30 years, what the neoliberal approach has done is to impose a divorce, and to let the domestic companies sort of flail off on their own, and they either sink or swim without any government intervention, without any government support. And I would say again that model has had deadly consequences, because without the support of governments to help beef up the domestic companies, the companies will not get far. And I think that's what the historical record shows. Again, I implore you not to take my word for it, but to go back and look at the history of that relationship in almost all of the industrialized countries. All right? Don't take my word for it. Look at the history. There's a couple of great books that have explored this history. I mean, taking opinion out of it, taking theory out of it, and just taking an inductive approach. What did countries do and when did they do it? I talk to students all the time, and it's very disturbing. I ask students, what have you learned? You know, you're in international development courses, you're in your international economics courses. What have you learned about the industrial policies used by the rich countries, you know, to support their own domestic industries over the last couple hundred years? What have you learned? Again, blank faces. It's a problem. Why people don't learn that history, I don't know, but it's a problem. So I implore you to look. Ha-Joon Chang, a Korean economist at Cambridge in the UK, has done an excellent book on this in 2002 called Kicking Away the Ladder, a term he took from Friedrich List, an economist in the 1800s. Even better book, a more elegant book, I think, is a book by a Norwegian economist, Erik Reinert, in Oslo. He wrote a book in 2008 called How Rich Countries Got Rich and Why Poor Countries Stay Poor, not to be confused with other books with similar titles. Reinert and Chang both go through this history exhaustively, and they document exactly the types of industrial policies, trade protection policies, subsidies, subsidized credit, public research institutes, public policies to promote better access to research and technology for their companies. A whole slew of various types of policies that, all the industrialized countries have used over time to beef up their own domestic companies. And what I fear is that the neoliberal development model of the last few decades has again imposed this divorce. And I feel like it's a shame. I feel like it's been quite unnecessary. It's been an experiment, if you will, because no country ever actually developed that way in history. And so it's sort of been this radical experiment. But I think that the experiment has gone wrong. I don't think it was the correct approach.